Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that everybody's doing well. This is going to be sort of our introduction to Macbeth, and I want to go over several things with you. Macbeth is one of the coolest stories we get to read throughout the year. It's sort of a rite of passage for seniors. You all have read Shakespeare and are familiar with him, hopefully to some degree. We're going to go over a couple of things just to kind of get you thinking on the right track today. Oops. Um, we're going to start with Shakespeare. Shakespeare was born in the mid 16th century. He was born in 1564. He died in 1616. A lot of people think that he was born and died on the same day, April 23rd or April 26th, but we don't really have any way of being sure about that. He wrote a bunch of plays. He wrote a bunch of sonnets, and is widely considered to be the greatest writer in English history. You all have probably read Romeo and Juliet. You probably read The Tempest and A Midsummer Night's Dream. For AP Literature this year, we're going to read Macbeth first. We will read King Lear a little bit later in the year. I may or may not have told you yet that King Lear is by far my favorite Shakespeare play. I love it. I think it's fantastic, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. If you don't know, Shakespeare is surrounded in some controversy because people think that he may have not really written the plays that are credited to him. It's not really relevant for our discussion. Whoever wrote Macbeth wrote an incredible play with a lot of interesting themes and ideas and characters. But it's probably something that you should know as an AP Literature student, that there is a lot of controversy around this, that people think that because he was the son of a cobbler and didn't have really more than a grammar school education, that he could not have possibly written these sorts of things. Especially since he knows so much about history, he knows so much about cultures in different countries. I mean, Romeo and Juliet set in Italy. Antony and Cleopatra has so much to do with Roman history that it's kind of hard to think that this guy that didn't know anything about any of that stuff could somehow just learn all this. We don't have anything that's written in his own hand. We don't have letters. We don't have manuscripts. We don't have anything that was actually written in his hand. And the name Shakespeare was a lot of times written as Shakespeare. In other words, someone who shakes a spear. A lot of people think that that is somebody's nod towards a Roman or Greek goddess of disguise, that the name itself is pointing to the fact that he doesn't really exist. But regardless, that's not really relevant. We might watch a documentary on that later in the quarter if we have time to, just because it's kind of an interesting thing. It's something that a lot of people are talking about right now. All that to say that I can tell you something about Shakespeare, and hopefully what I say is true, but somebody else might say something different, and there might be just as much evidence for that. We just honestly don't have all the facts about William Shakespeare that a lot of people think that we do. My background with Shakespeare, just so you know, I took a Shakespeare class as an undergraduate student. I also took one as a graduate student. And then I taught our Shakespeare elective last year. So I've read a lot of Shakespeare. I've really come to love him and enjoy him a lot, and I hope that you will throughout the year too. One thing that you should know about Shakespeare, he wrote during the reign of two different monarchs. He wrote during King James I and Queen Elizabeth I. That's important because when he's writing a play like Macbeth, it has to do with a king, it has to do with the country. That could be seen as good or bad. If he depicts a king in a really, really negative way, and King James sees that, that could be really bad for Shakespeare. So sometimes he writes some really, really interesting things. He wrote a play called King John that's kind of almost not even read anymore, but that really mirrors a lot of what's going on at the time with Queen Elizabeth. So Shakespeare's pretty brave in some of the stuff that he does, and one of the reasons he's such a great writer is because he addresses so many things that are going on in England at the time of his writing, but he does it kind of in disguise. He's not talking about King James the First. He's talking about Macbeth, when really he actually is talking about some things that's going on. We'll hit a little bit on the historical aspects and ideas of all that. But that is something to know. One reason that Shakespeare is thought of as kind of a great writer is he was saying all these things about the culture and the monarchy without really coming right out and saying them. It would be like if you wanted to criticize President Obama, and you wrote a book that was really cleverly disguised, but people still got your message. Except in that scenario, President Obama would be able to kill you for saying something negative. So Shakespeare's pretty cool in that regard. I want to talk quickly about your anticipation guide before we actually talk about Macbeth. I don't want to go through every single thing. I do hope that you were able to submit this online, but I want you to think about a couple of different things that are brought up here. The ends always justify the means, and what I mean by that is, do you think that as long as you reach your goal, it doesn't really matter how you got there, who you hurt, what you had to overcome, as long as you did, as long as you got where you were aiming for, is it doesn't really matter how you got there. Loyalty to family precedes loyalty to government. Who are you more loyal to? Do you care more about breaking the law, or do you care more about upsetting your parents? Are you in control of your own destiny? Does absolute power corrupt? This anticipation guide is something that we'll probably do a few times. You maybe have done one before, but all of these questions are things that I want you to be thinking about. How do you feel about these different issues? And then we're going to see that they're all really relevant in Macbeth. The idea of power is important. The idea of family is important. The ends justifying the means. All those sorts of things are going to be very relevant. So I hope that you took some time to really think about where you stand on those particular issues and what your opinion is. There's no right or wrong answer to any of those things. I just want you to be thinking about these different concepts and thinking about how do you handle those sorts of things. How do you feel about your family and obedience to the government and loyalty and all those sorts of things. Okay. So please submit that on Canvas if you've not done so already. We'll try to look at it again towards the end and just see if your opinion has changed at all since then, since the beginning. All right, now on to Macbeth. Macbeth was probably written between 1599 and 1606, so kind of in the middle of Shakespeare's writing. We don't have an exact date for it. It is kind of thought of as one of his historical plays, but it's more like historical legend. Shakespeare wrote several different types of plays, which you probably already know. We have tragedies, we have comedies, we have historical plays, and then we have what's often referred to as problem plays or the romances. The tragedies are plays in which basically everybody dies or a lot of people die. That's kind of what identifies the tragedy as a tragedy. That's in a nutshell. We will maybe read a few essays and articles that will help us identify it further. Comedies traditionally end with a wedding at the end, but really they are more loving. They're not necessarily funnier, although they usually are funnier. Historical plays are based off of history. All of his Henry IV plays, for example, King John, Antony and Cleopatra is considered one of his Roman histories. Julius Caesar is one of his Roman histories. Generally speaking, those are true to what actually happened in history. He takes a little bit of poetic freedom, I guess, in certain places. Then we have problem plays. The problem plays don't really fit into a category. They maybe have some elements of tragedy, but they also have some elements of a comedy. The Winter's Tale is one, for example, and we just don't really fit those in a category. Macbeth is a tragedy. So I've kind of already ruined it for you that most of the people here die. It's probably also based on sort of a legendary history sort of thing, meaning Shakespeare did use some historical accounts, some historical stories to shape this. There probably really was a king named Macbeth in Scotland. But That's very, very loosely based. Most of the stuff in here is not accurate to history. Macbeth in legend, if you were in theater, you know that you never are supposed to say the name of the play Macbeth in a theater because it's considered to be bad luck, because the play is considered by many to be cursed, because there's all this, as we'll see, sort of uh, horrific sort of stuff that goes on in it and that surrounds it. So instead, it's referred to as the Scottish play. Macbeth takes place in Scotland. So if you hear anybody use the term the Scottish play, that is referring to Macbeth. The characters, just to sort of go over them, just so you have an idea, you probably won't remember everything I say about them right now, and that is okay. We have Macbeth, he is the main guy. And one thing I really want you to think about Macbeth is his transition throughout the play. He starts out in one category and really ends in a totally different one. And we're going to look at the beginning and kind of see in these first few scenes how he's portrayed, how other people think of him, what other people say about him. We have King Duncan. King Duncan is Macbeth's king. He is in charge of Scotland. He is the ruler. We have Lady Macbeth. Lady Macbeth is one of Shakespeare's most famous characters. She is just very, very interesting. She's a very, very powerful woman. She is Macbeth's wife, and we'll really dig into her character too. But she's a fascinating character. Banquo is Macbeth's best friend and fellow warrior. When Macbeth's fighting, Banquo fights with him. So Banquo and Macbeth are both subjects to King Duncan in Scotland. Then we have these three witches, and these are sort of one character. The three witches are together all the time whenever they show up in Macbeth. They're the very first characters we see in the play. And so I want you to be thinking about them. We'll talk a lot about them too. So the way you'll read most of Macbeth, and hopefully I will be back with you guys before you finish, is you will read mostly as a class. I'll have you read some at night. Whatever you don't finish in class, you do need to finish for homework. So for example, today I'm going to have you read scenes 1, 2, and 3 in class, and then for homework you're going to read scene 4. If you don't quite finish scene 3 in class because I took too long on this lecture, then finish scene 3 and finish scene 4 tonight. But for the most part, I want us to have roles and read aloud in class because I think it just sort of helps with the roles and how we read. But if you're going to open up your play, I want to point out a couple of things to you. I'll read through Act 1, Scene 1, so you don't have to read that as a class. We have thunder and lightning, and then we have enter three witches. When shall we three meet again, in thunder, lightning, or in rain? When the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won, that will be ere the set of the sun. Where the place? Upon the heath, there to meet with Macbeth. I come, grey Malkin, Paddock calls. Anon. Fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air. This is a great opening scene. It is very creepy. Hopefully you see here that Shakespeare is setting up a very mysterious Halloween sort of feeling mood. We have the three witches. And basically all they're talking about is, when are we going to meet with Macbeth? When the hurly-burly's done, that means basically like the turmoil, the fight, the battle, when the battle's lost and won. So we know there's a battle going on somewhere. That'll be before the set of the sun, so it's going to be soon. This battle will be over. Where the place will meet with Macbeth. I come, grey Malkin, and Paddock calls. These were like familiars. They were thought of as supernatural kind of animals or companions to witches. One thing you should know about Shakespeare's audience in the 16th and 17th centuries is that they were very, very superstitious. For them, witches were real. They were legitimate in terms of doing creepy things, eating goats, killing things, all the sort of things that we don't associate with witches today. It's very much real for Shakespeare's audience. So when he has these characters on stage doing these things, it probably really freaked those people out because they thought this is what witches do. So Grey Malkin and Paddock calls would have been like these mysterious animals that witches were able to control or that helped witches. And you'll see that pretty much every time they talk, that they're mentioning weird things. At one point, they're making like a brew over a pot and throwing in all these sort of creepy things to help make this potion. So everything about them is kind of what we think of when we think of like scary Halloween witches. Shakespeare's playing on that, but his audience would have thought that this was really freaky. Okay. Fair is foul, and foul is fair. Hover through the fog and filthy air. Hovering through the air is obviously something people can't really do, but again, they think that witches could do that. Fair is foul, and foul is fair. One thing that's interesting in Macbeth is this comparison, or duality might be a good word. These two things that we keep seeing, and they're opposites. Fair is foul. Well, that's not true, right? Something that is fair is not also foul. Um, but Macbeth will say the same thing. His first line in the play is so fair and foul a day I have not seen. So we have an interesting idea here of things being both good and bad, things being nice and things being messed up. So I want you to kind of be thinking about that duality. Can something be two things at once? How can something be both fair and foul when they sort of mean the opposite thing? But that's set up here at the very beginning. Act 1, Scene 2, I want to just quickly touch on this with you. We have Duncan entering in. I want you to pay close attention in Act 1, Scene 2 and Act 1, Scene 3 about how Macbeth is characterized, how he is portrayed. Okay, Duncan here. One thing I don't really like about your app is it's hard to tell the iambic pentameter, which I'm sure you all know by now. Shakespeare wrote, and you might not have any idea what it is, but Shakespeare wrote an iambic pentameter. The easiest way to see if something's an iambic pentameter is there should be 10 syllables a line. Okay, so in the actual book, Duncan says, "What bloody man is that? He can report," and then it goes to the next line. So, "What bloody man is that? He can report." Well, that's 10 syllables. Duncan is speaking in iambic pentameter. Shakespeare has characters who are well educated and usually who are of some sort of nobility speak in iambic pentameter. Okay, so in this case, Duncan, being king, is obviously noble, he's well educated, he's speaking in iambic pentameter. His last line there says, "the newest state." Well, that's only 3 syllables, right? But Malcolm picks up the next line and says, "This is the sergeant." Okay, so we get up to 8 syllables. It's not quite 10. But Shakespeare will have educated characters sort of finish those lines for one another. It helps us distinguish between characters that Shakespeare's identifying as noble and well educated and all that stuff versus the other people. The witches aren't speaking in iambic pentameter, so, or most of the time they're not. So it's an interesting thing to note. Okay, but that's why we have these weird cutoffs and why people have such a hard time reading Shakespeare, because if you read it line by line, Duncan's line would read like this: "What bloody man is that? He can report, as seemeth by his plight of the revolt, the newest state." Well, you don't read Shakespeare that way. You don't stop at the end of lines. Shakespeare's writing an iambic pentameter for a reason. You should read it just like you would read a normal sentence. Stop at periods, pause at commas, all those sorts of things. So Duncan's first line should be read like this: "What bloody man is that? He can report, as seemeth by his plight, of the revolt, the newest state." That's how the line should be read. You don't pause at the end of lines. Okay. That might also help just with your understanding. People feel like if you reach the end of a line, then you've reached the end of the idea or the meaning or whatever, the end of the sentence, and then it's like, well, this sentence doesn't make sense. That's because Shakespeare never intended the sentence to end right there. Okay. We have a captain who comes in Act 1, Scene 2. The captain has been messed up from the battle, from the war, and he is talking great things about Macbeth. Macbeth is really brave and really valiant. Okay. Act 1, Scene 3. Okay, we have witches again, and we have Macbeth and Banquo. Just a note on Act 1, Scene 3. The second witch says that she's been killing swine, she's been off killing pigs. Again, this would really pertain to Shakespeare's audience because they thought that if animals died mysteriously on a farm, that it was a witch that did it. And in this case, Shakespeare's playing on that we've been off killing all these animals. Okay, I want you to pay really close attention to what they tell Macbeth and Banquo. What is it that they said, and how will it affect Macbeth and Banquo? But hopefully, you see here at the beginning, Macbeth's characterized as a good guy. He's a loyal subject. He's a great hero. He's a great fighter. And I want us to see kind of how he transitions. So between class today and homework tonight, get through Act 1, Scene 4, and we'll pick up some more tomorrow.